Hollywood taught us to worship an image. Tuxedos that never wrinkle, smiles that never shake, and men who seem born to command a room. But the cameras only captured one angle. There was another lens, one the public never saw. A quiet market where ambition and access were traded after midnight, and where saying no could end a career before the first table read. For decades, the city sold the dream of the gentleman actor while hiding the bill that came with it. Some paid in rumors, others paid in silence, and a few paid with everything they had. People still ask, how far did it go? And how high up did it reach? The uncomfortable answer is that the system didn't need a signed contract to function. It ran on fear, favors, and the unspoken knowledge that beautiful faces can be used like currency. Tonight, we're following the thread through whispered allegations, memoir confessions, and long-buried open secrets to see how some of the most admired leading men were shaped, cornered, or consumed by Hollywood's quiet economy of obedience. And it starts with a boy who embodied rebellion on screen, but couldn't afford it in real life. On magazine covers, the men of Hollywood were sculpted into myths, warm voices, hypnotic eyes, a kind of perfect steadiness. Studio publicists built that fantasy with ruthless precision. They polished backstories, staged romances, and managed the press down to the adjectives. Behind the glamour, there were house rules, morality clauses that could end a contract overnight, loyalty meetings that weren't really about loyalty, and private gatherings where casting took place without a single camera in sight. The message was simple: be charming in daylight, be compliant after dark, and never make the mistake of confusing the two. But the first time James Dean walked into one of those rooms, he wasn't a legend. He was a number. James Dean, the rebel who couldn't refuse. When James Dean arrived in Los Angeles, he was broke, nameless, and, to certain people, conveniently moldable. Accounts from the era describe private hotel parties where young hopefuls were identified by numbers instead of names. Dean was remembered as quiet, tender-faced, and easy to manage. According to people who lived nearby, he'd leave late-night rehearsals with swollen eyes, then show up the next morning with a clean shirt and that distant stare the camera loved. Biographers have repeated a persistent claim. Somewhere up on Wilshire, a clandestine recording supposedly captured Dean in a compromising situation, later used as leverage. Whether that tape ever existed, the power dynamic did. Handlers reportedly coordinated who he was seen with, what he wore, how he answered questions. Dean's public rebellion, the cigarette, the squint, the silence, read like freedom. In private, it looked more like choreography. His death came fast, the crash that froze him at 24, and the legend outran the life. But if Dean's image was curated by others, one star later admitted openly that he curated his own access on purpose. Marlon Brando, the confession that shocked everyone. Marlon Brando didn't do euphemisms. In interviews and later profiles, he was quoted admitting that he slept with people who could help his career without pretending it was anything else. The 1940s and 1950s were packed with gatekeepers, directors, producers, culture brokers who could close a door with a single phone call. Brando's approach was brutally pragmatic. If intimacy was the toll for a role, he paid it. Rumors tied him to late-night practices with revered directors and quiet rescues by studio titans when scandals threatened big releases. Diaries and second-hand recollections point to a ledger of personal debts and private protections. It worked, for him, but the same path destroyed people who didn't have his armor. One of them walked beside him early on, then slipped under the water and never surfaced again. Sal Mineo, evidence in a briefcase, a life cut short. Sal Mineo rose too fast and met too many powerful men too soon. As a teenager, he reportedly attended dialogue sessions that weren't really about dialogue and learned quickly that innocence was negotiable. He kept going because talented boys without family money always kept going. In interviews that never fully aired, Mineo hinted at a cache of names, photos, and tapes he claimed to have collected, an insurance policy, or a fuse, depending on who you ask. Then he was killed outside his home. Officially, the explanation was simple. Unofficially, nothing about it felt simple. The untouched wallet, the missing briefcase, the timing. The city called it a robbery gone wrong. Friends called it a warning right on time. The message traveled through every dressing room in town. You can be adored, you can be useful, but you can never be disobedient. Rock Hudson, the smile that was managed. Rock Hudson was the industry's crown jewel, the perfect blend of height, dimples, and composure. Publicists sold boyish sincerity. Insiders described something colder, a product carefully placed at gatherings where checks were signed and deals were sealed. According to memoirs from people who worked the periphery, drivers, assistants, fixers, Hudson's presence was sometimes the incentive itself. He'd pour drinks, charm a table, then vanish down a hallway without argument. Managers were the air traffic controllers of this world. They trained young men how to talk, when to laugh, and when to leave their own boundaries at the door. Years later, private notes attributed to Hudson suggested a recurring theme: I wasn't allowed to say no. Whether the exact wording is accurate or not, the sentiment fits the machinery he lived inside. And he wasn't the only gentleman trapped by the gentleman image. Cary Grant and Clark Gable, mythic men, managed lives. Cary Grant, the suave template Hollywood stamped onto every tuxedo for 30 years, lived in a house that doubled as a quiet airport for influential visitors. Reports from the era, the gossip rags, the whispered studio memos, suggest a social calendar that functioned as a casting pipeline. When appearances mattered more than explanations, Grant's multiple marriages did strategic work. They deflected, distracted, and kept the headlines tidy. Clark Gable's early years read like a script someone else wrote. The patron who paid his rent, the favors returned in private, the silent understanding that connections were bankable if you played along. Industry lore has it that Gable helped remove an openly gay director from a flagship project, allegedly to protect secrets from the past. Whether that was calculation or paranoia, it shows how a myth protects itself. It cuts out anything that might expose the trick. Meanwhile, two other icons learned that in Hollywood, a beautiful body is a banknote that never stops circulating. Gene Kelly and Tony Curtis. Choreography without music. Gene Kelly could do things with gravity that looked like magic. But away from the camera, the choreography changed. Accounts describe training circles where promising performers were evaluated offstage, their flexibility judged in categories that had nothing to do with tap counts. Kelly, in private letters quoted by friends, vented about being asked to dance for them. The pronoun doing a lot of work. The lights at those gatherings were soft. The expectations weren't. Tony Curtis, too handsome for his own anonymity, reportedly spent a stretch of days rehearsing at a casting director's apartment in the late 40s, and later admitted publicly that he did things not in the script to advance. He understood the exchange rate. His face bought him an audition, his compliance bought him a job, and his silence bought him a future. The only thing it couldn't buy was peace. For Anthony Perkins and Dennis Hopper, the toll came with footnotes that never made it into the credits. Anthony Perkins and Dennis Hopper, clauses you'll never read. Anthony Perkins will always be remembered for a character who couldn't tell the truth from the performance. Off-camera, biographers say he navigated a maze of introductions arranged by powerful attorneys and media brokers. Old contracts are famous for their morals language. The rumors around Perkins add a darker line. Expectations that were never typed, never signed, but always enforced. In private letters attributed to him, he wrote about fearing not death, but exposure. Dying slowly, he said, to earn the role, and then spending the rest of his life dodging the bill. Dennis Hopper, the counterculture rebel, was once shut out of the system he thought he didn't need. Then he needed it. Accounts from the period claim he attended an elite audition night at a hilltop mansion, endured what was asked, and was quietly ushered back onto a set. Later, in interviews, he framed it as soul-selling. The line between sin and survival blurs when the rent is due and the door is locked from the outside. And in the silent era and studio heyday, 3 more idols learned that beauty is not a blessing in a city that treats it like collateral. Valentino, Tyrone Power, and Montgomery Clift. The Tender Trap. Rudolph Valentino's legend began in rooms that didn't carry his name. Before California, he passed through clubs where introductions were arranged for wealthy patrons who wanted the company of someone future famous. He became America's fantasy of romantic fire, even as private notes described a first night that felt less like seduction and more like surrender. Tyrone Power's ascent was dotted with retreats, where executives tested more than acting choices. Insiders described swimwear try-ons with strings attached, and early contracts following mornings that left people quiet for days. Power smiled for the magazines, then stared at the ceiling at 2 a.m., wondering what part of himself he'd promised away. Montgomery Clift, all wounded eyes and aching restraint, confessed to close friends that he traded intimacy for opportunity before the critics called him brilliant. No regrets, he reportedly said, but something died. The public thought it was a character study. The people who loved him knew better. Double lives weren't fashion statements. They were survival plans. Tab Hunter, Richard Chamberlain, and Troy Donahue. The mask must fit. Tab Hunter was 19 when a police raid nearly erased him. A powerful protector intervened, and the price of salvation was silence, plus a series of staged romances that painted a picture the studios could sell. In later memoirs, he described knowing exactly why he'd been chosen, not for acting, but for being quiet and beautiful in the way the market demanded. Richard Chamberlain, the television dreamboat, learned caution to the level of paranoia. Friends say he closed curtains in the middle of the day, unplugged phones during visits, and turned down roles that required too much press. When a partner suggested honesty, Chamberlain did the math out loud. Love doesn't pay if the audience leaves. Troy Donahue, the golden boy who never seemed to age, walked into rooms where auditions started with a locked door, contracts arrived with roses, fortunes evaporated with a single rumor, and the man in the mirror watched himself get edited by other people's appetites. Addiction filled the space where a real life should have been. Others broke, not because of what they did, but because of what got printed. Van Johnson, George Maharis, and John Gavin. One headline, no appeal. Van Johnson, the neighbor every mother trusted, once admitted to a friend that the rent had to come from somewhere before the studio checks did. The park benches in this town don't have soft edges. He made choices that bought him a screen test and a night of sleep indoors. He didn't brag about it. He didn't have to. Everyone who made it past the gate knew the price list. George Maharis lost everything to one sting. The city's vice squads were famous for cleanups that did less cleaning than labeling. One arrest, one headline, and a leading man becomes a cautionary tale. The scripts stop arriving. The phone stops ringing. The fans move their loyalty to a face that hasn't been fingerprinted yet. John Gavin kept the surface immaculate. Underneath, drivers, doormen, and assistants recall midnight drop-offs at apartments with no names on the buzzer. He'd come back with the look of someone who did what he had to do and didn't want to talk about it. The town rewarded him with roles, then punished him with whispers, then rewarded him again. That's how the pendulum works here. It swings. You hold your breath and hope it swings back in your favor. Not everyone got to die an old legend. Some were taken out by the very world that taught them how to survive. Ramon Navarro, The Last Night. Ramon Navarro was once as big as the medium itself. The silence era adored him. The sound era kept him. His final night is documented in police files and shadowed by rumor. 2 young men came to the house. He ended the evening as a statistic. In the autopsy's dry language, everything is clinical. In the oral histories, it's tragic, the kind of ending that feels less like a crime and more like a judgment passed by a city on one of its own. What makes Navarro's death haunt people decades later isn't only the brutality, it's the suspicion that a list of private clients existed, a map of who visited whom and why. Officially, that list was smoke. Unofficially, the town smelled like something still burning. A few chose not to burn at all. They walked away. But even their exits carry the fingerprints of the system. Farley Granger, Don Murray, and Guy Madison, Quiet Wars. Farley Granger fell in love with a writer who organized his calendar, guided his roles, and, if you listen to people who were there, negotiated arrangements that were equal parts romance and risk. Granger later wrote about the tenderness and the lies, about learning to be in love and to pretend in the same breath. It wasn't just a double life, it was a double education. Don Murray, dignified and careful with words, once gave an interview line that nearly said it all. Some things are never written into contracts. He didn't need to elaborate. In Hollywood, a sentence like that can be a memoir. Guy Madison, the clean-cut cowboy, reportedly worked dinner parties where the food wasn't the point. Hosts requested him shirtless as design, then as company, then as something you don't repeat. He smiled because the city pays extra for smiling. He left with a room key and a roll. That's what they used to call a fair trade. There were outliers who chose honesty, and there was one man who turned the whole thing into an open secret. William Haynes and Scotty Bowers, refusal and facilitation. William Haynes told the studio no when they told him to change his private life. They fired him. He built an empire anyway, designing estates for the same people who once called him a risk. In interviews, he said he didn't regret love, but confessed that early on he did what he had to do to be seen. That's the thing about pride here. It's a long game. Scotty Bowers was the city's unofficial switchboard. From a gas station, he allegedly arranged hundreds upon hundreds of introductions, a web so large that when he finally published his stories late in life, the response was less shock and more relief. The rumor had always been bigger than anyone's courage. He said he never kept a ledger. Maybe he didn't need one. In Hollywood, memory is a currency, and no one wants to spend it unless they have to. So was it all exploitation? Or was it negotiation inside a rigged market? The answer depends on who's telling it and whether they survived telling it. How did the machine work and why it lasted? The casting couch didn't survive decades because it was efficient. It survived because it was unaccountable. Morality clauses gave studios the legal right to terminate anyone who embarrassed a brand. Fixers handled arrests, arranged false alibis, and swapped headlines like trading cards. Tabloids fed the public a diet of clean romances and heroic anecdotes. If something inconvenient leaked, a quick engagement or a sudden charity campaign smothered it. Agents warned clients, "Don't fight the rumor, crowd it." That meant new photos, a new partner, and a new movie to reset the narrative. Meanwhile, the people at the bottom of the call sheet learned the first rule. If you're not rich, you can't afford integrity. That's not cynicism, it's math. Which brings us to the question everyone asks at the end of stories like these. Was it all just back then? Has it really stopped? Or just changed clothes? Modern Hollywood has intimacy coordinators, anonymous tip lines, and PR firms that apologize at the speed of Wi-Fi. NDAs are thicker, lawyers are faster, and social media can turn a rumor into a verdict in one afternoon. Officially, the culture is cleaner. Unofficially, the game found different rooms. Access now travels through influencer mansions, conference suites, and private flights. The etiquette is sleeker, the euphemisms more polite, and the deals still prefer night. Ask anyone who's new here and doesn't have a famous last name. There's still a toll booth somewhere between undiscovered and cast. It might be a favor, a secret, or a silence you agree to keep. The city changes its wardrobe every decade, but the mirror hasn't moved. And yet, one question keeps clawing at the screen. What would you do? The men who taught the world how to be charming were sometimes the ones least allowed to own their own lives. Some negotiated agency inside a corrupt economy. Some were cornered, blackmailed, or broken. A few refused and rebuilt themselves from the ground up. The rest became myths so large that the truth could only circle them in whispers. So, has the machine stopped, or did it simply hire better stylists? Maybe the real scandal isn't that actors traded their bodies for roles. Maybe it's that a city built an industry where that trade made sense. If you had the chance to be immortal on screen, to live forever in black and white and Technicolor, would you pay the price the door guy quotes you at midnight? Or would you keep your name, keep your sleep, and let the dream belong to somebody else? Tell me what you think. Drop your take in the comments. If you found this eye-opening, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell. We're just getting started, and the next story might be closer to today than you think.